You're from Texas. Just as a preliminary question, how do they do things in Texas?
I will quickly clarify that while I most recently lived and worked in Texas, I am from New England. And in fact,
right.
my grandmother is from New Jersey. So I'm returning home, coming back to the East Coast.
Full circle.
Full circle. But I have worked at the state education agency in Texas. I worked there for more than 7 years. And clearly a big question. So happy to take that in any direction, but not sure if there's one you'd like to focus on.
You know, I think the primary focus that most of us have here today is funding in one way or another. In New Jersey, unfortunately, we have become so reliant upon property taxes, and as a preliminary concept, I would submit to you that property taxes are the most regressive form of taxation in New Jersey anyway. And would you agree with that concept?
Well, I would just say I don't think Texas is fully funded by property taxes, 100% in the school system. That is the only source of school funding.
Very interesting. And we hear from various pundits how we're doing it wrong. Ultimately, the end result, and I know that you had stated, Commissioner, that we fund need, not outcomes. Perhaps we've gotten lucky, but I think overall we have a great educational system here in the state of New Jersey. And I really feel that the complaint that we hear most often is it's simply too expensive. If we go district by district, as the chairwoman had mentioned, yes, we are going to find those districts where the outcomes perhaps don't meet what we would anticipate based upon the dollars going in. But overall, I believe that New Jersey does some things well, despite ourselves, perhaps. I don't know where the educational system in Texas ranks nationally, but it's very interesting to hear that property taxes are the sole source of funding for education. And I'd be curious to learn more, perhaps not today, as to how they accomplish that, what the infrastructure is like which would permit it, and how people are able to sustain a reasonable form of living in their communities, being so reliant upon the local property taxes. In New Jersey, I would submit that it's socioeconomically disadvantageous to rely solely upon property taxes because it is regressive. Those that are in homes that may have appreciated greatly in value over the last decade aren't necessarily making the incomes that would suggest that the community is wealthy. And that's where I think the whole argument falls apart. Would you generally agree with that?
I certainly would welcome the more detailed conversation, and I think as you're getting at that interplay of how we're calculating local fair share and what that looks like in terms of income tax and property tax, I think is a really important conversation to have as part of this.
And I know my friend across the way here made reference to Governor Christie. Governor Christie was in office 9 years ago. You know, as we get older, perhaps the memories fade, but my memory is still pretty intact with respect to Governor Murphy. Governor Murphy last year, through his educational commissioner, created a system whereby we were incentivizing property tax increases. Those schools that chose to exceed the cap were rewarded by the state with additional funding. My question to you, would you agree that that is an unconstitutional manner in which to fund our educational system?
think the question changed a little bit there at the end, but I think you're referring to the tax levy incentive aid with the
Correct.
previous administration. And would just note that that is not something proposed in this FY27 budget, and certainly happy to speak about that in more detail if helpful.
I'm glad to see it go away. I think it was wholly improper, and it was contrary to our mission to help our local communities. We're not here to help our local towns raise taxes. I also submit we're not here to spend money that we don't have, but that's a different topic. With respect to the whole process of incentivizing tax levy increases, are you aware of there being any reports or data within the Department of Education which either supports that concept or reviews as to whether or not that is something that we've chosen to avoid this year and the reasons therefore?
I think Governor Sherrill is very clear on her affordability agenda, and certainly raising taxes does not support that. But I think, as you asked in terms of the actual usage of it last year, I'm happy to go into that if that's where you're heading with it.
If there are any such reports or data that you're able to share through the chair, that would be appreciated.
Absolutely.
I don't mean to put you on the spot with regard to something that your predecessor was responsible for. Commissioner, when I compare what this administration has proposed with respect to school aid against what the formula would produce without modification, meaning no aid caps, no 3-year averages, schools appear to be underfunded by roughly $200 million. What led to the decision to underfund schools in that fashion?
The question about what led to the decision to put in place the caps, I think, is a combination both of looking at the feedback in terms of the prior pieces, and there was strong positive feedback for some of the reduction in volatility, and the acknowledgement that it is still a tough budget year, and trying to find that balance while we know that the entire formula needs to be reassessed.
There are, Commissioner, I would submit 4 ways to measure the underfunding with an average of $200 million. And all the figures I'm going to mention are based upon analysis that was produced by the Office of Legislative Services. $145 million overall underfunded compared to there being no changes at all. $165 million equalization aid underfunded compared to there being no changes. $225 million underfunded net because of caps with the changes, both caps on increases and caps on decreases, and $265 million underfunded for schools capped at 6% with changes. Are you able to provide your own comparison of the SFRA against the formula, including the administration's changes, to help us understand how those numbers were determined?
Absolutely, Assemblyman. And as you're getting at with those different pieces, there are different nuances to those scenarios around whether, again, special education is actuals versus census, the interplay of the 3% and the 6% caps. So happy to make sure we follow up on any and all of those scenarios, and also, again, speak to the data that we looked at, both in terms of how that worked and the feedback on the adjustments in the short time we had for this year's budget.
One of the frustrations, Commissioner, when we're speaking about the affordability agenda is that the 6% cap on increases for schools that perhaps have lost money year over year over year has underfunded schools, as stated, by $265 million. That is 0.4% of the proposed budget, essentially less than half of 1%. Is the administration, Commissioner, concerned about producing a $265 million shortfall at that low a cost? Why did we make that decision?
I think, as you mentioned, there's quite a couple of calculations in there. There's a few different calculations, but I would say, both things are true. Absolutely, this is historic funding, and we also know that we wish it was more funding, as you mentioned. Someone mentioned, maybe money we don't have, and I think that combination is really important as we look at hard budget choices. But I think bringing down the real cost of education while continuing to make sure we're providing excellent opportunity for students is where we need to go moving forward.
And totally agree with you in that respect. And I've heard you mention, Commissioner, and I'm grateful for it, several times that we're looking at producing a new school funding formula that perhaps we would all find to be somewhat more fair and equitable across all of our districts. Can you tell us where we're at in that process? Has it begun?
We are at the very, very beginning as I'm here before you today. This is an involved process, and I know some folks on this committee went through this both in the original piece and as it moved forward. We have a lot to do on this, and this is going to take up a lot of time and, again, have a lot of work with stakeholders. So I would just say we're at the beginning.
Commissioner, I know that our job is to meet with all of the department heads, the commissioners, and hopefully arrive at a consensus in terms of what is appropriate to include in the budget and what perhaps we can exclude, create savings so that we can realize opportunities in other areas. I've heard you suggest that there may be some opportunity to make changes, whether it be tweaks to the existing numbers or perhaps even greater changes, elimination of the 6% cap, for example. Are we prepared to do anything significant between now and July 1 with regard to what is proposed?
I think that's an important question for this body, and in conversation with the governor, and as she shared that question about how we look at trade-offs and how this budget gets across the finish line, I know is a very collaborative process that we'll all be working together on. I would say, and this is in part of the recommendations for why we didn't change certain pieces on their own this year, I think we, as we look at the formula overall, have to be really cognizant of creating a small change that has a large unintended consequence. And so for many of the things we might do, I would encourage us to think about them with wholesale funding formula reform.
Totally agree with that. And I also agree with the concept of unintended consequence to minor changes. But hopefully, new administration, new eyes on those numbers are going to result in not just minor modifications. I think that's a theme that's been repeated several times here this morning. Rather than increase, for example, transitional aid to municipalities by $100 million, perhaps that money would be more appropriately allocated within your own department to assist those districts that are struggling, and we've heard an abundance of examples. Would you be in agreement, Commissioner, that decisions that were made in recent years, such as the incentivizing of tax levy increases and the institution of flat funding where more appropriate funding may have recognized the demand for increased aid in certain school districts, would you agree that it's possible that mistakes have been made over the last several years and this is our opportunity to correct those errors?
I would certainly again note, I think we've talked about many things that are not working, some of which, may be classified as mistakes, but some of which are again related to real issues that we need to take up. And I think the question again about what happens short term versus medium term versus long term is really important, but we absolutely have to be looking at how do we make sure this works for us moving forward.
Okay. Thank you, Commissioner.
Thank you.